Hi everyone. I want to talk for a bit today about a sociological exploration of age discrimination that came out in March 2022 and that I read pretty soon after that. The book's called Ageism Unmasked, Exploring Age Bias and How to End It. I first learned about this book from a discussion with the author Tracey Gendron on the Politics and Prose bookstore channel, which I watch pretty often, and I'll leave a link below to that conversation in case you're interested. Now, I'm definitely familiar with the concept of ageism, which on a high level is basically what it sounds like, treating people differently, and typically in the context of ageism, unfairly, based on their age. But I haven't spent a whole lot of time thinking about it deeply. Some of that lack of familiarity comes from a lack of direct experience, although the author briefly mentions that discrimination against young people who might be thought to be ignorant or fit certain stereotypes of their generation. That kind of discrimination can exist, but I wouldn't really say that that kind of discrimination has ever really affected me in a way that noticeably detracted from my quality of life. And the author focuses mostly in this book on biases against older people. Still, she also points out that you don't have to be old yet, however you define that, to be a victim of what she calls self-directed ageism, or the fear of aging, which she convincingly argues contributes to more direct ageism as we try to separate or distance ourselves from older people who remind us of our own aging. And I'll be using the words old people or older people in this review to describe the targets of this kind of ageism, which I totally realize there are many different dimensions and shades of aging, and I don't mean to say who should or shouldn't consider themselves old, or oldish, or older, or whatever term you prefer. So let's just start right off the bat with me saying that I think this is an important topic, and this book raised several interesting ideas that are worth thinking about, but I'm not really sure I'd recommend the book. I think it comes across as overly simplistic and falls short of what I'd like to see in a full and critical discussion of age bias and discrimination. What I mean by that on a high level is that in her efforts to find and unmask this horrible villain called ageism, author Tracey Gendron sometimes feels as if she's failing to consider the limits of her own argument and the merits of alternative points of view. This is partly due to the language she uses, which one of the few Goodreads reviews present a month after its publication referred to as the terminology of the woke clerisy. Now, I'm pretty sympathetic to many progressive thinkers and agree with them on many fronts, and this language in itself doesn't really bother me at all. It certainly doesn't mean I should discount everything that the author is saying, but when I hear certain kind of buzzwords, it does serve as a little bit of a red flag for me just to put on my own thinking cap and see to what extent I agree or disagree, or even just don't know about some of the stuff that the author's claiming here. But I certainly can understand that reviewer's sentiment that by using the critical theory-inspired parlance of the progressive left, terminology like oppression, marginalization, trauma, toxic masculinity, privilege, the author has consciously made a choice about who this book is written for, which is totally fine, too. I mean, these are useful concepts for framing discussion, but we just have to recognize that they've also, by this point, taken on a political and cultural association, for better or for worse, and this makes it so that I wouldn't really recommend it, for example, to many of my own older relatives who are generally more conservative-leaning and who probably would be turned off by this kind of terminology, even if they agree with many of the sentiments embodied in that terminology. But beyond that, certainly there are some who will be put off enough by this language that they won't even consider the book in the first place, and that's okay. But for readers like me who are curious but natural skeptics, I think Gendron has missed some opportunities here to create an open discussion, which she could have done by presenting her case a little bit less as stated fact and more as simply her own argument and assessment of ageism. Saying that aside for a while, though, I really do want to focus on what I took out of this book because I think the author does highlight some interesting food for thought. First of all, there is an implicit fear of aging that's built into our culture and our conversations and interactions with others. I'm talking here not simply about the fear of our own mortality or the understandable fear of losing abilities we once had when we were younger. I'm talking more, and the author is talking more about how society amplifies these fears and even creates new ones, such as the fear of looking old, even when it carries with it no direct limitations on our abilities. The author outlines many cultural examples of this, and although most readers will find at least some of these examples to be a bit of a stretch, that doesn't negate that I generally agree with overall observations. The anti-aging industry in particular takes advantage of these fears and feeds back into them, making sure that we're constantly thinking about how to keep ourselves from aging with face creams, vitamin supplements, baldness remedies, and things that go beyond the normal habits of simply living a healthy lifestyle to maintain our health for as long as we can. Of course, you can imagine how this argument gets a little bit tricky because there are plenty of changes that happen to us as we age that on one hand shouldn't be stigmatized, but on the other hand are not necessarily so bad to try to prevent if we can. I guess to some extent a big question is not whether it's okay or not to go bald, for example, but how we feel about the process. Even in a world with limited fear of baldness, some people might still be enticed by the prospect of delaying balding. And you can substitute there your own aging-related condition of interest. But I guess the author's point here is that there's a big difference between a world in which we delay the physical effects of aging but don't fear it, where it doesn't cause us that much discomfort, and where we accept that eventually it will come. And on the other hand, a world in which the effects of aging are cast as things to worry about and that we should fight tooth and nail to simply avoid accepting for as long as we possibly can. Admittedly, both of these attitudes will always exist in all of us to some extent, but the author is hopeful that we can move towards the first of those two worlds, one more accepting of our own and others' aging. Another big point that the author hits is that the way that our society treats aging is closely interrelated with a culture that views dependence and vulnerability as weaknesses, when they really could be a valuable part of human experience, relationships, and connection. In a Western culture, particularly in the United States, where being independent is valued so highly, it's easy to see why the idea of having to depend on others as we age can be very scary for us. Of course, this is only exacerbated by the emergence of whole industries that separate the old from the young to relieve relatives from the so-called burden of caregiving. And this really leads to what the author calls self-directed ageism in all of us when we specifically fear becoming a burden on others, even though caregiving for elderly relatives and even other members of society could actually be an enriching experience and perhaps might even encourage us to challenge our own fears of aging. Although the topics explored in this book weren't profoundly new or anything, it was valuable to think about this, and it definitely made me consider how I want to care for my older relatives and how I'd hope to be cared for myself when I grow older. It also reminded me of one of my favorite short stories in Gishgen's collection, Thank You, Mr. Nixon, which I reviewed on this channel a little while ago. That story was called Amaryllis, and I think it explored these themes beautifully. There was also a discussion of how we tend to downplay the value gained from old people's life experience, as well as other skills that are uniquely improved with age, even well into old age, such as what you might call wisdom. The author's argument, which I agree with, is that despite that people lose some abilities and productivity in our current economy as they age, societies can be imagined, and some have even existed, where older people continue to be not just accepted members on the periphery of society, but actually leaders who are integral to societal well-being. Along the same lines, old people's opinions are often devalued, as they're often cast simplistically as foolish, senile, or curmudgeonly. We see this sometimes in political discussions where the young, cast as open-minded progressives, and maybe sometimes a little too eager, are pitted against the old, cast as foolish, stodgy conservatives. But there is value in both of these points of view. Perhaps the old are sometimes too satisfied with taking comfort in the experiences that they're used to rather than looking to change things that are unjust or imperfect. But they've also seen the pitfalls of good intentions gone awry many times before. And perhaps the young are optimistic and less set in their ways about what works and what doesn't, but also lack the same life experience to have developed true wisdom about limitations between idealism and the current practical reality. Of course, the author's take on this is a little different than what I just said here, as she identifies as a progressive, and thus her argument falls less along the lines of my argument that even if old people are more conservative on average or simply more cautious, there is a need for well-seasoned points of view in the mix with all the new blood. Her argument is more that we shouldn't assume old people aren't politically progressive, since, for example, many of today's old people were active in the civil rights movement of the late 20th century. Thus, I think both of us have shown a bit of ageism in our presentation of this section, me in casting older people too uniformly as conservatives, and her in dismissing the fact that although older people are statistically a little bit more conservative, at least in the United States, this in itself should not be a reason to devalue conservatism. Now back to the criticisms for just a bit. I think many of the shortcomings of this book are evident in the title itself, Ageism Unmasked. We're shown immediately that we'll be dealing with another one of these insidious isms, up there with racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and we're going to unmask it, see it for what it is, and hopefully squash it so that it'll never show its ugly face again. So the author makes this move of putting ageism right up there front and center as an ism, which is something that these days I think has to be done with great caution, because these isms risk creating a binary right-wrong dichotomy, and they evoke a defensive response when we're accused of them. Now, in certain mindsets, to see that defensive response and question it more deeply, to try to see through our immediate reactions, that can be a really good exercise for us. It's something I've certainly found helpful when considering racism or sexism, for example, and how they can permeate my own behaviors at times. But it also can shut down certain important critical conversations if we're not careful. If presenting someone's actions as ageism feels too much like an accusation rather than a critical but ultimately understanding observation. Because here, for example, who will dare to disagree with the author if that means we're one of these vile ageists? The author also often compares ageism with many other forms of discrimination, like racism and sexism, which again makes some sense, but only to a point. I would have liked to see more thoughtful exploration of not only how these forms of bias and discrimination are similar, but also how they differ. Instead, this relationship is often simply reduced to, if you wouldn't make this judgment or say this thing about someone due to their race, then you shouldn't make this assumption about an older person. Although she acknowledges that aging does eventually involve at least some challenging biological changes, she sometimes seems to come a little too close to minimizing these dimensions and arguing that any attempt to generalize about such changes is discrimination. For example, the final chapter about COVID-19 was on point about the ways in which older people were sometimes maligned as the reason everyone else had to be unfairly locked down. However, this chapter was equally baffling to me in its attempts to minimize age as a risk factor whatsoever. Sure, I shouldn't assume if my grandparents are pretty healthy overall that they will be unable to handle COVID if infected simply because of their age, but I think it's pretty darn reasonable to assume, as many older people did for themselves, that our bodies and immune systems, by and large, do become weakened in this regard as we become older. These generalizations can be dangerous, especially when used to marginalize a particular person for being part of a group, such as elderly people, but when they're part of a more open system of thinking and when they're coupled with strategies to avoid these pitfalls, I think they can also be really, really useful. I, for one, think that decisions like letting elderly people have dedicated hours during the height of the pandemic to shop at the grocery store was a reasonable and thoughtful decision, and I don't think it would be an overstatement to say that lives were saved through these policies. And one final criticism I had was in how the author challenges the very idea of generations. Baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, saying that because of their arbitrary breakpoints and sweeping characterizations of highly heterogeneous groups of people, they're basically useless as categories. And again, I see the essence of the point she's making, and I do agree. I shouldn't be assumed to fit every stereotype of millennial simply because of the years I was born. And likewise, the fact that my siblings and I are split between Gen Y and Gen Z simply because the few years between us are where the boundary falls. That's a bit silly, but again, I think she goes too far in minimizing the usefulness of these ideas as sociological concepts. I mean, I do fit many of the stereotypes of the millennial generation, and as long as people aren't treating me poorly without getting to know me because of such assumptions, that's totally okay. In fact, I've seen plenty of research on the habits and behaviors of millennials that I find accurate and valuable in understanding my own experiences. And despite the slightly arbitrary boundary definitions of these generations, these are loose concepts. If someone responded to your Twitter post with the insulting OK Boomer hashtag to dismiss your opinion, which the author uses as an example in this section of the book, it's probably not because they looked up your birth date and verified that you indeed are a boomer because you were born in '63, so you must be a profoundly different person than you would have been if you had been born 3 years later. No, they're just being a jerk, and this is just regular ageism with one of its many faces. So I don't think that we should simply dismiss the whole notion of generations simply because a generational tag can be unfairly used to dismiss or stereotype people. So my bottom line is this topic is interesting, the author raises some important points, and I hope that some good discussion will come from this book. Nevertheless, the way the author frames the issue is not the way I personally find most compelling, and I think that there were some missed opportunities for a deeper dive. Ageism may have been unmasked by the time you finish this book, but we haven't really gotten to know this insidious villain yet as much as I'd like to. I'm not really sure what all is out there on the topic, though, so let me know if you've got any good opportunities for exploring the topic of ageism. It might be a while before I get to reading more on the topic, but other viewers might appreciate suggestions too. In any case, I hope that watching this review encouraged you to think a bit about your feelings about your own and others' aging, and maybe each of us can help to redefine the role of aging in society in tiny but meaningful steps. So take care, and happy reading.